Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, this is John Sack, founding director at HighWire Press. We're just waiting for more attendees to log into the webinar, and we'll get started in a minute or two. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Again, this is John Sack, founding director at HighWire Press, and you're at the webinar on MECA, the Manuscript Exchange Common Approach. My co-presenters and I will take you through this agenda over approximately the next hour. We'll also have time at the end of the presentation for questions and answers. So that can be conceptual Q&A as well as more technical Q&A. If you would put your Q&A into the questions box, there should be in your control panel, you should see a question box. And just go ahead and type in there. We'll address the questions at the end of the meeting. And of course, if you have any audio problems or other kinds of problems, go ahead and put that into the chat box. So let's first begin by talking about the problem that MECA was created to solve. We see that there are several problems in our peer review processes and the processes by which we move information across systems in our ecosystem. One is that authors are often irritated at the time and effort that they have to go through when they submit and then resubmit and sometimes resubmit articles from journal to journal. Reviewers mention that they feel their reviews are valuable investments of their time, but those reviews don't move on when papers move to other venues. As well, we see recently, especially in biomedical fields, a new volume of articles moving to and from preprint servers, so another type of transfer, if you will, across systems. And then the big issue that brought many of us together in this effort was seeing that we were starting to solve this problem between one organization and another by implementing what I refer to here as a pairwise solution rather than coming up with a uniform solution. So if one organization would work with another, we'd create a solution, but then when a third organization came along, we'd implement yet another solution. So we were looking for a common approach to moving manuscripts across systems that solves for the above use cases, but also would solve some additional problems that we wanted to take a look at. And all we had to do was come up with a very collaborative group, and we did. The group of vendors and publishers that worked together on this project over the last year include HighWire, Aries, eJournal Press, Clarivate, and PLOS. What we're doing is developing a common approach. We are not developing a software or a database. We're not creating a central service that all manuscripts have to flow into. What we are doing really is recommending best practices for data exchange and for the tagging of the data that goes across systems. This is not a proprietary approach. That is, it's not something that's unique to these 5 parties. And we are implementing it all using any CC BY license so that anyone can use it for free. And we just ask that as you use it and if you have to extend it, that you document the extensions you make. We're hoping for wide adoption of this with the others beyond the initial 5 who are working on this. To do that, we're doing various types of outreach, working with other organizations, but also, of course, presenting this webinar. So let me start by indicating some of the principles that we used in devising this. And I'm going to focus primarily on the principles that are in bold here. First is that journals and authors set the rules on what transfers. What MECA provides is a framework that allows a great many types of data to flow, but it will be journals and the authors of the manuscripts who decide whether a particular manuscript will transfer and whether when that manuscript transfers, do the reviews go along with it or not. That kind of thing will be decided by journals and authors. Second important principle is that we're trying to enable seamless transfer across system divides. But we recognize that this will not necessarily be a complete submission. For example, if someone puts a manuscript into the bioRxiv preprint server and then indicates that they'd like that manuscript to flow on to the Journal of Cell Biology, the information that's captured by bioRxiv may not be sufficient for a complete submission to the Journal of Cell Biology. There may be author checklists, for example, that have to be completed. And so what MECA is going to do is essentially provide the infrastructure so that a submission can be started. And then it will be up to the receiving manuscript manuscript system to indicate back to the submitting author, what else is needed. So principle number 3 is that we're going to start a submission, but we can't guarantee that it's a complete submission. Principle number 4 is about having a minimum viable product. We're all interested in building wonderful systems, but we also see that there's a current challenge in our environment. We wanted to get something started in 2017 and complete the build out in 2018 rather than creating something that we really couldn't even begin to build until 2018. And then finally, item number 6, just reiterating that what we're providing here is best practices and recommendations, sample tagging and code, but we're not providing code itself. We're not producing a system or a service. There's no hub where all manuscripts flow to. So in a way, it's not like Crossref or ORCID where people go somewhere and put something in. And this seemed to be a really good principle so that there was no concern about privacy, about the ability to trace manuscripts flowing across systems. use cases that we saw? Well, the obvious one is right at the top of a journal submission system to a different journal submission system. That was our primary use case, being able to move things from one journal to another. And especially when the journals are in different manuscript systems, this has been a challenge. The second use case is preprints, moving manuscripts to and from preprint systems. So something comes into bioRxiv and the author wants to move it on to the Journal of Cell Biology. That's a key primary use case. And the reverse, an author submits something to the Journal of Cell Biology and can, without doing any further work, have it flow on to the bioRxiv preprint system. The third major use case is one we call syndication, and we've considered this a primary use case. This is syndication, sort of a term of art here, but what we're saying is there are various systems now that authors are interacting with, like Overleaf and Authorea, probably many others coming, that need to move information directly from their system into a submission system. And rather than every one of those tools implementing a pairwise interface, we'd like to encourage those systems to use MECA. So, for example, if Overleaf wants to work with Aries, they'll implement MECA rather than implementing a special interface between Overleaf and Aries and a different special interface between Overleaf and Benchpress and yet a third special interface between Overleaf and eJournal Press, for example. So we see this simplifying the systems overall. And then the last use case is we've considered a secondary one, and this is exporting from systems. So, for example, many publishing platforms now export information from their publishing platform off to third-party systems, for example, to do deposits into institutional repositories or into PubMed Central. We think those could be standardized using MECA as well, but that's not our primary use case. Our project's been divided into several areas, and now my co-panelists are going to talk us through each of these areas. Sally?
Thank you, John. I'm Sally Yubnowski from Aries Systems, and Joel Botkin and I will be covering these various project areas. As you can see, we did divide the project up into seven discrete topic areas, really in an attempt to answer the following questions. How can we be sure that we're using the same terms to mean the same thing? How do we package the individual components and what format will be used? What metadata is written out for the submission and what standard should be used? And I think standard is the important thing to note there. We also had a question about what peer review metadata should be included. Do we include editor decisions or just reviews? We need to be able to supply transfer information to identify the sender and the intended recipient along with contact information in case there is an error or there are further questions. And of course, we need to uniquely identify each submission, regardless of where it's been and where it's going. Finally, we had to determine what method we should use to transmit the package. So as I mentioned, Joel and I will go over these areas. And we will start with the vocabulary. Next slide. Thank you, John. So the first challenge was to make sure that we're using the same terms to mean the same things. And our goal was to standardize on some semantics specific to the submission preprint ecosystem so that we operate with a shared vocabulary. Terms like review or responses are called out using the same syntax, whether in the tag set or in the manifest file. And data that's external to the tag set should be organized in the bundle container using consistent naming standards, such as manifest XML. Finally, we are looking at using a JATS standard, and we need to be sure that any JATS or JATS-like tags do not conflict with standard JATS usage. We don't want to use the same term and describe a different meaning. As many of you know, JATS was designed to be locally extensible, and the JATS compatibility model was developed to help creators of JATS-based document models to know when the extensions they make work with existing JATS documents. The MECA project is complying with the JATS compatibility model. So next, I'd like to talk about the package. So while we were inspired by the EPUB file format, we really didn't need to use the spine, and so we opted for simplicity. Therefore, the files are sent in a zip file and always represent a single manuscript. We are investigating the registration process for a new MIME type and file extension with the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. Although subdirectories are not required, they are supported if they are mapped in the manifest XML file. And the manifest XML and the transfer XML files are the only required files. All other files are optional, and the file names are free-form, and the usage is mapped in the manifest XML, not by file name. We can include source files, but they must be mapped in the manifest XML. So there can be cover letters or conflict of interest statements. And the business and editorial rules decide what is included in the package. But again, only the manifest and transfer XML files are actually required. One thing to mention, I guess we're going to talk about the tagging the submission next. So the submission's metadata is tagged in the article XML file, and that file must conform to the JATS green TTD, which is also known as the Journal Archiving and Interchange tag set. Green is the most permissive and flexible of the JATS models, and it's more forgiving. It requires less validation, and because it requires less reorganization and regrouping of the existing content to convert it to the XML, we think that will be a better solution overall. Just as a side note, the journal publishing, which is sometimes called the blue DTD, is a moderately prescriptive tag set. And one of the reasons we couldn't go with the blue DTD is that it does require publication date information. And as John mentioned, at least the first use case is when we transfer a submission prior to acceptance. So for the submission information that goes in the article XML file, we're only going to write out the metadata that applies to the highest revision of the submission. That's in contrast to the reviews XML file, which Joel will discuss. And as you can see, we have various metadata that can be included. Most importantly, an article identifier. That might be a manuscript number, it could be a DOI, or a universally unique identifier. The article title and corresponding author are required, but we will have places to map the article type, category, classifications, keywords. We also will allow for tagging related articles in preprints, funding information, custom metadata, and figures, tables, and supplementary material. So I think we'll look at a tagging example next. And the reason this screen is being presented is not to walk through the XML line by line, but just to indicate that we really have developed complete sample files with details. We are still refining this. The goal is at this point, is to demonstrate that we do have sample files. You can see that we are identifying the pub ID types. There are identifiers, title information, contrib group information, and so forth. And we will have more information and more sample files available soon. So at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Joel Plotkin, and I think Joel will be talking further about some of the project areas.
Good morning. Hi. One of the files and topics that Sally mentioned was being able to move peer review data from one system to another. And the use case is basically a review has already been done on a manuscript and at one journal, and for whatever reason, the manuscript might have been rejected, and so it's going to be transferred to another journal. And if the editors-in-chief across the two journals might want to make it easier or less onerous on other peer reviewers in the future, they might, have a policy to exchange some of the peer review data. We're not going to really comment on what those policies are, but we want the technology and these best practices to be able for one platform to share with another platform the peer review information, specifically information about like what was the questions that were asked, what were the reviewer answers. The policies at a higher level can say, well, should the reviewer names and information be redacted or not redacted? And so we didn't think that this information naturally fell into the JATS XML and DTD and file. So we, decided to set up a second XML file called reviews.xml that would have its own set of tags, around 16 tags, that would allow people to describe what the questions that were asked and what the answers were for each reviewer and transfer those from one system to another in an organized fashion. Even though we're providing this nomenclature and this tagging methodology to transfer the data, again, I just want to stress that it's up to the journals and the publishers to figure out the policy side of this and how much to share and privacy concerns at a different level. We're just trying to provide the technical platform to do it with through this file. Next slide. And then as a part of this is just an example, as Sally said, that we actually going into the nuts and bolts and trying to build a workable DTD and to model out the questions and the answers. And as this project evolves, we'll actually, there'll be later on in today's discussion be a website to see how these XML and DTD files are evolving. And that's not just vaporware, it's actually stuff we're trying to get working examples for. Again, this is us diving into a little more detail that we're actually trying to take some of the data from our systems and model it out to make sure that whatever we come up with works in the real world. Another file or set of information that we didn't believe belonged in the article XML file, but we thought was important to transfer information from one system to another system is a high level of transfer information. And so there we proposed developing a transfer.xml file that would be part of this package that we're sending back and forth. And at a minimal, the transfer.xml file will help describe who was the source of the information, what was the destination of the information, maybe some security authentication codes to make sure, hash codes to make sure it wasn't tampered with, and so on. But basically the source could be, information would be the name of the sender of the journal or the society or the publisher that's generating this package, and the destination is where it's going. And it might have some phone numbers and names in it in case the recipient has some problems with the package information. They know who to call and follow up with. And again, this is a real world model of some XML, and we're not going to go into detail, but we just want to make sure that what we're trying to accomplish is actually doable. So we've been working with some examples to see how it models out. Another topic that we try to cover is identity. And at a very simple level, when we started, we were basically working with just a clean board, and we would say, oh, well, we should identify manuscripts in these packages with DOIs. But then it quickly evolves that DOIs have a lot of built-in information about the source or the person who created a DOI, their institution information. And if you want to transfer an article from one system to another, it's not really ideal to have implied source information. And we're not looking to replace DOIs or replace internal tracking numbers, but we did feel that when files are transferred from one system to another external system, it's very helpful from either a support side or from an internal computer side to have a unique identifier to say, oh, well, this manuscript number 123 is the same manuscript I'm having problems with, and so on. And because we don't want to use a DOI, we had to come up with a way of uniquely identifying these packages of information. And we're not here to reinvent the wheel. There's, in computer science, there's a system called UUIDs. It's well documented. UUID type 1 says take the date, the time, the MAC address, and a random number, and just generate basically a 32-digit string of alphanumeric characters, and it will guarantee that there are no collisions. So basically, people can, two different platforms can generate an ID simultaneously, but they'll never overlap. And this at least allows computer systems or people to uniquely identify the packages as they move from one system to another without any implied data in the identifier. Another area that we had to discuss is how are we going to transfer these packages from one system to another system. And basically, we wanted to first fall back on the techniques that we're already doing. And pretty much every publisher, every journal is using FTP at this point in time. For security reasons, the group decided that in the future we should go to a level of encryption, so we should try to have a long-term best practice goal moving towards SFTP or FTP over SSH. And the current stakeholders said we should do this sooner than later, but we felt that giving everyone 6 or 8 months trying to move to this encryption at least is a good starting point. There were questions about, can we transfer these files or these packages over a REST API or a SWORD API? And we think that eventually we'll get there, and the project teams will go into REST and SWORD and more interactive APIs. But those are more long-term strategic goals. And the tactical process right now is FTP, just because almost all the vendors and publishers on the phone call knew how to use that very successfully.
Thanks, Joel. My name is Chris Hyde from, I'm the product lead at ScholarOne, the Clarivate Analytics. You have just heard from my co-presenters on the background and the project areas, essentially the what and the why of the MECA project. It is my privilege to speak on what is next for this exciting initiative, and let you know how your organization may get involved. Group activity for the first half, 3/4 of the year consisted of 3 major components. The first is to get the word out on this project, presenting at conferences. Several of us were at JASCON in April. We presented our first public presentation of this project at SSP. I know that John presented at ISMTE, and that Tony will be speaking at the Force Conference later this year. So we really have done a lot to get the word out. From here, we plan to engage with interested parties, focusing on authoring platforms, repositories, preprint servers, to get more involvement in this initiative, and sort of bring in other stakeholders. As we engage with the wider community to get input, this project will move on to later phases. Part of that is getting this webinar together, giving people an opportunity to ask questions about the technical information, and really evangelizing it. In addition, we'll be several of the parties involved in this project will be putting together a reference implementation. Information on that reference implementation will be available at our website, manuscriptexchange.org/how-to. You can see the address here on the slide. That will be available shortly. It's not currently available, but should be available soon. Later on this year, we will also be looking at potential NISO recognition, if appropriate, but we're still researching that possibility. And then finally, the main question you're probably asking is, when can I expect to see these types of implementations from my vendor? These will begin to roll out in next year, 2018.
Hi, this is Helen Atkins. I'm the Director of Publishing Operations at PLOS, and I'm batting cleanup today. So just to finish out, so we can get to some questions from folks. We basically want to hear from people. What do you want? What do you want to help with? What would you like to learn about? Other applications that that you come up with, we want to hear about those. We have, as you know, as you've heard, we have a website where we're gathering some information. We're going to be putting up documents and plans there. We'd like to hear from you about those. If you want to get more involved, we're happy to bring more people in on the discussions. If you just want to keep apprised of what's going on, you can contact us and we'll sign you up for our mailing list. I think there was a question earlier that I'll just jump in and answer. We are recording this session, and we will be putting up the slides and the recording as well on the website, probably within the next day or two. So we're looking to see what interest there is and how we can address the interest. What your particular interest is, and that's about it. So please put your questions into the question box, and I know we've gotten a few already. I think John's going to moderate the question answering, so I'll turn it back over to him.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm going to try to moderate this. Just learning how to use the webinar function. There are more windows than you can imagine in a webinar control panel. Let's see. There was a question. I think, Joel, you're going to pick up my last question.
Yes. So the question is, does the transfer XML file support keeping track of the full article history? Like if the package went from journal A to journal B to journal C. I think right now when we initially designed it, it's pairwise source and destination. There was a discussion, and maybe we have to loop back as we increase the audience and participation. But part of the issue was if we had a history from the manuscript moved from journal A to B to C to D, and we include that history, that possibly we were revealing too much information that should have been kept private that the author didn't want to disclose. I think the actual XML tagging will allow a history, but we will have to work at a much higher level for what the policies are, what the information should be transferred. And that also goes to another question about will reviewers be allowed to opt in and specify what should or shouldn't be transferred and stuff like that. Again, the best practices are going to model out that the data can be put into the file. How the industry, publishers, journals, and societies decide to use the technology is going to be a much larger discussion open up to the whole world. And so I can imagine systems where on the review form, the reviewer specifically asked, can we transfer this information if the manuscript's transferred? Or some people might have an editorial policy where they have a terms of service where they own that review data and they have the right to transfer it. And other journals might say, no, we'll never transfer your information. So what we're building is just an underlying exchange platform, and the policies will go from journal to journal, publisher to publisher, and we have not set those.
Thanks, Joel. Sally, there was a question about how editorial manager transfers reviews.
I think there were two questions I saw that pertain to editorial manager in particular. One point I'd like to make in continuing with Joel's discussion is that in editorial manager, the reviewer must agree to transfer a review. It's up to the journal policy to whether they will ask that question, but each reviewer has the opportunity to agree or decline to transfer their review and or their identifying information. I believe there was also a question specific to editorial manager that had to do with a new field in our version 14.0 release called the Global Manuscript Identifier. And that is a field that will enable publishers to track transfers among their editorial manager journals. So from one EM site to another EM site to a third EM site and so forth, because of course we allow, there's no limit on the amount of times a paper can be transferred between editorial manager journals. There is a particular piece of metadata that will identify where the paper started. So you can always, publishers can always trace the history of a manuscript. Now, in comparing or contrasting that with the universal, the UUID that Joel mentioned, is that we really did need, each publisher or each submission system has their own method of tracking manuscripts, whether it's a manuscript number, another kind of identifier. For editorial manager, we have the new global MSID, but those don't necessarily translate to other systems. So by using the UUID in a particular format that ensures there are no collisions among systems, every transfer is unique. And we will be using that UUID, I believe, in naming the zip file, and that is also another reason why we wouldn't be able to use the global MSID. So that they are, the UUID is in addition to the global MSID from an editorial management manager standpoint.
All right, thank you. Joel, there was a question about article XML.
Okay. One of the questions about the article XML file was whether does this whole MECA scheme, in order to work, does that mean that the article has to be tagged in JATS? And the answer is no. When we refer to the article XML, we're really referring to transmittal information that the systems have in their databases. For example, a peer review system or a publishing system might have the title, the abstract, and the author names in their databases. And as a part of the transmittal package information, we don't want to lose that. So we needed a way to convey it. We decided to recycle the entire JATS DTD and just fill out the forms, fill out the XML with the fields of data that the databases did know. So in the transferring package, if the sender knows the title, the abstract, corresponding author names, they're going to send article.xml file with the JATS fields filled out with those pieces of metadata.
Thanks, Joel. There are questions about identity. A couple of questions on this. Let's see. Sally, do you want to start those? And we call in Craig and Joel if we need some more on those. I'm looking at the one from Evo. How does identity compare to the new global manuscript ID in EM? Oh, you did answer this, right? The EM release 14.0, right?
Right. So we did. It's an additional identifier. The global MSID is really for EM to EM transfers. The UUID that we're going to be using as part of the manuscript exchange process is for between systems, inter-system, not intra-system transfers.
All right. Let's see. There is a question about can the author view the UUID, or is it available only for journals? How about Sally? Do you want to tackle that one also?
Sure. I believe that'll be up to each submission system whether they choose to import that information and expose it to an author, but this is really a behind-the-scenes identifier. It will be used to identify the zip file that is sent that has to land on, at this point, on an FTP server. It's used inside the article XML to identify the submission, along with other identifiers like a manuscript number, and if we at some point chose, we could use a global manuscript identifier that's system-specific. But also, as Joel mentioned, keep in mind what we're sending in these XML files is metadata. It's not the full XML for the submission. The package will still contain additional files, source files, conflict of interest statements, figures, tables, anything that would make up a submission. Because, of course, the goal in transferring is to allow the recipient of this metadata and files to create a new record in their system. And if, whenever possible, we'd have enough metadata to create the new record for a new submission on a system, and possibly bring in the reviews if those were sent along with the manuscript. So the identifier is really just a solution so that we don't mix things up from different systems and different authors.
Thanks. There's a question.
John, I think Helen has some questions and answers.
Oh, thank you. I was reading some of the questions, and it seems like we probably need to go back to the beginning again and reiterate that this is something that goes from system to system or from journal to journal and is not something that an author does. It's something that if journals want to participate in this and they are using a manuscript system, they would work with that manuscript system. So it's not like there's a MECA out there that you would submit to. It's just provide a framework so that we can all have this interchange and use the same protocols to do that rather than making it up each time. So add another question if that's not clear, but there is no software. There's just a structure here. If someone wants to use it, they need to build the software. So each of the folks who's been involved in this, we're all building software to support this so that we can have that interchange among the group and with others as well. And it allows more people to participate in that. But we're not providing software to anyone else. We're just providing the structure for that.
As I've been typing in, for those who have asked questions, I've been typing the answers as best I can through the GoToMeeting interface. But as Sally was saying, there was a question, is there software behind this? And the answer, to reiterate what she was saying, is no. It's really a set of XML, DTD, and best practices and standards. For example, the JACT XML DTD that NISO supports doesn't have any software behind it, yet it's very powerful for people to use to transfer information. And that's sort of what we're going towards here.
I think one of the things we can do also is put up an FAQ on the site that will take a lot of these questions and write out the answers. Wants to
feel the question, just speak up. John's on mute right now.
So this is Sally. I just wanted to add to what both Joel and Helen had mentioned, which is we are all doing transfers today, as John calls it, the Pairwise Transfers. So every time there's a new submission system or a new archive, a preprint archive, it's sort of recreating the wheel every time. So I think the objective here is to set aside the recipe, the standard, if you will, so that anyone that comes in and wants to participate in Manuscript Exchange can go to a particular location, understand what is required, what the rules are, and set up their own exchange or export. So, for example, with Editorial Manager, we export to a number of systems, and we take imports from a number of systems. And I know that all the other submissions likely do the same thing. So by standardizing and making it that we all have the same format for the article XML or the transfer XML, it allows other organizations and entities to participate as well. And as I said, we're doing it today. We're just really attempting to standardize and document.
There was a question about how MECA is being funded. I would just say that up to this point, we're all volunteering our time from each of our organizations. So there is no external funding.
There are a few questions about author participation. Like, does the author know that these manuscripts are being transferred from system to system? And the real answer there is this approach is a set of best practices and XML files. But in today's world, we already have journals that say your manuscript isn't appropriate for our journal. We recommend to transfer it to another journal. Do you want us to transfer information? Yes, no. And as Helen said, and Sally said, we already have proprietary ways of transferring manuscripts from one system to another, but we decided as a team, this effort, that it's best to try to find some best practice to make that common. And another follow-up question is, does that mean publishers over the long term will be able to send manuscripts back and forth instead of their proprietary systems? The answer is yes, that would be a goal. But we're not forcing MECA upon everybody. It's sort of a field of dreams where we need to build these standards, and hopefully over time people code towards those standards.
So this is Sally. I do see a question regarding things like custom submission questions or custom questions presented to the authors. And just to confirm, the article XML will make use of existing functionality that allows custom information to be conveyed using custom meta tags. We are trying to make sure that whatever is included in the article XML file incorporates all the metadata that most of the systems are currently transferring. So this will be standardized, but not too different, I think, from what we're currently doing. Secondly, there was a question about whether users can expect to see updates made to various peer review systems as they react to align with the MECA standard. And I think that's why we're all involved. So as far as ARIES goes, we are looking into what needs to be done to make sure that we move toward the standardized transfer practices that are outlined with MECA, and are really excited about the initiative in general as a way to really make sure that we are serving our authors and our user community as best as we can. And I think finally there was another question that asked whether we can utilize the MECA protocol for inter-publisher journal transfers. I think that the goal would be long-term that in general transfers make use of these standardized definitions for the article XML, transfer XML, the manuscript XML, and the packaging and transmission methods. So I hope, I think that's the questions I see that are applicable right now, so I'll turn this over to someone else now.
There were a couple of questions about backward compatibility that I cannot answer, but maybe somebody else can. Maybe not.
So Helen, this is Sally. I think at this point, maybe, you know, did anyone mention that we are looking into some of those projects and the reference implementation? The idea being that if we're all moving in that direction, we will likely have some concurrent functionality and move in the direction of a standard transfer package.
This is Joel. There were some questions from the audience about backward compatibility. There's two types of things like JATs. There'll be different versions as the standards evolve and going forward. And as far as existing systems, there's probably 10 or 15 mechanisms or hard-coded proprietary system-to-system transfers coded up right now. I would see that as new software is developed, some of those older techniques might age off and go more towards this standard. But again, everything's totally voluntary, and a lot of these systems have a lot of embedded time and money with some of their legacy transfers. So it might take several years maybe a half a decade to get to everyone using the same transfer mechanisms that we're suggesting here.
So this is Sally. There was a question whether we have surveyed authors and reviewers to find out if they would want to participate in this, because the questioner says that we understand from the start that the problem exists, but wouldn't want to see this be a greater burden on reviewers. So I think at the very beginning, John talked a lot about why we even got together with this project. And the reason is that I think many reviewers have expressed concern about redoing the same work over and over again. They review a paper, it's not accepted at the journal to which it's initially submitted, the paper is transferred, and because this reviewer is an expert in that area, they're asked to review it yet again, but on a different system. So I think that the goal would be I think it's a known problem that people are currently redoing work that they've done before. And as I mentioned earlier, in some of the submission systems, and I can only speak to editorial manager, we currently do transfer reviews, but we always ask the reviewer. The reviewer must explicitly agree to transfer the review and or their identifying information. So none of this is done without their knowledge. And again, as far as authors are concerned, I think that, as John mentioned, authors really get tired of entering the same metadata to multiple systems. Whatever we can do to lessen the burden on the authors and reviewers, I believe is the real impetus for this entire project. And we do it to some extent today with all the different systems, and the objective at this point is to standardize.
One of the questions that was asked was also about backward compatibility, and with a slightly different question, which was, it looks like there's going to be a lot of iterations and change for the first set of best practices, and so where do you start? And I think we had probably 10 or 15 2 or 3 hour phone calls among the initial participants to figure out some of these questions and answers. But one of the themes among those phone calls is that we're really looking for a practical product outcome here, that we're not just developing these best practices as ivory tower type things. And so along the practical approaches, we have to start somewhere. So we started with FTP, but yet as new use cases evolve as far as REST and interaction, the working group should address those in the future. But yet we shouldn't allow future needs to stop us from producing a practical working solution that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit we can agree to right now that should be addressed. And some of the outlier use cases might have to be addressed in the future, but that shouldn't stop us from starting here.
There was another question. Hi, this is Helen. There was another question about interacting with systems at the other end of things, the accepted end, composition vendors, typesetters, and those. We have had some discussion about that. We saw that as a secondary priority in terms of the applications that we're looking at. So we haven't had any active discussions with folks on that end of things, but we're aware of that. And if folks would like to participate, we would be happy to take on any ideas on that. I think that's all the questions. Does anyone else want to say anything to wrap things up? I know John's still on mute. We're sorry, John. Did such a nice job of starting things. Maybe we should just wrap things up. Again, we'll post all of this up on our website. We'll add to our FAQ, answering a lot of the questions that we talked about here today, maybe in a fuller way. And we hope that you'll participate with us. Anybody else? Anything else? Shall we close up?
I think there was one last question that came in on
okay.
meetings in Europe. pretty much to encourage as much participation as possible. Everything's been done virtually so far with GoToMeeting web conferences. And if you go to the website that's on the screen right now, we'll start posting more information about how to participate, but it will probably be virtual so everyone can attend no matter where they're physically located.
Great. Okay, well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this morning.